All right. Well, as you know, today's Torah portion is Vayak'heil. And Vayak'heil means and gathered or and he gathered. So I've already given you the greetings. And so in the interest of time, normally I will read the Hebrew of the first aliyah and then give you the English translation. But today, because I'm trying to keep it a little bit shorter after the extended announcement, I'm just going to go straight into the drash. So today I'm going to talk about some things that may be new to some of you, but maybe you've heard before. So let's get going. Right, so this is what I'm going to begin with. I'll begin with this question. What does work mean to you? Does it mean earning a paycheck? Or does it mean breaking a sweat? And as most of you know, the Torah prohibits work on the Sabbath, but the word means different things to different people. And can you run a marathon on Sabbath? What does it feel like? What if it doesn't feel like work? That's what I mean to say. And the Talmud answers these questions in detail, listing fully 39 different categories of work, along with all of their subcategories and sub-subcategories. But the sages identify hundreds of laws that govern the observance of the Sabbath or Shabbat. Laws about how to cut and heat your food, about what and where to carry, about how to tie your shoes even, believe it or not. And where do they look to formulate these laws, I might ask? Well, the sages say that the basis for this understanding, what work actually is, it comes from this week's parsha, Vayak'heil. So when you open this week's parsha, you probably would have expected to see at least 39 or so verses about what is and isn't work, and spelling out those distinctions of those categories and explaining what each one entails. But that's not what we find. Instead, we find a mere 3 verses at the beginning of the parsha, and in which Moshe commands Israel regarding Sabbath observance. Now we read this in Exodus 35, 1 through 3. Moshe called the whole community of the children of Israel to assemble, and he said to them, "These are the things that the Lord commanded to make. 6 days work shall be done or may be done, but on the 7th day you shall have sanctity, a day of complete rest to the Lord. Whoever works or performs work thereon on this day shall be put to death. But you shall not kindle fire in any of your dwelling places on the Sabbath day." Now, if you didn't know anything else about the Sabbath, I suppose you would read this passage and at least you would not have a clear sense of what it actually means to take Shabbat or not to work. But you would at least know that the word work, or melacha in Hebrew, is off limits. And the only specific that you could really point to is no kindling of fire in your homes. So there's certainly nothing here about preparing food or carrying or tying shoes. It sort of makes you wonder if the sages derived their understanding of prohibited Shabbat work from this parsha. What were they seeing that we're missing? That is, it turns out that the sages weren't just looking at these 3 verses. They were also looking at the very next topic of discussion. That is, immediately after these verses about Shabbat or Sabbath, we're told about a commandment to construct the Mishkan or the tabernacle. Now, the sages took note of this, that these 2 topics, Sabbath and the Mishkan, are discussed one right after another in the text, so that they made a startling inference. And they said that the temple or the template for prohibited work on the Sabbath can be derived from the way the Mishkan was constructed. And in other words, if you want to understand what is that you're not supposed to do or not allowed to do on the Sabbath, just look at what the people did when constructing the Mishkan or the tabernacle or the Ochel Moed, the tent of meeting. Now, to make the Mishkan, the people wove beautiful linens, so no weaving on the Sabbath, or they used a range of colors to dye the linen, so no dyeing on the Sabbath, right? So the sages identify 39 different activities that were used to build the Mishkan, and all are prohibited on the Sabbath. But let's probe a little further into this inference that the sages have come upon. And let's first ponder this explanation with this question, this explanation that I offered for why we derive the laws of the Shabbat or the Sabbath from the laws of the Mishkan might be familiar to you, or you might be hearing it for the first time. But either way, think about it as you ask yourself this: are you satisfied with this explanation? And does it resonate with you? If not, what do you find dissatisfying about it? So it's one thing to understand the legal inference that the Talmud is making here. But let's ask a broader conceptual question. Is there some deep connection between Sabbath and the Mishkan that we're supposed to see? And because at first glance, these two things seem to have nothing to do with each other. And aside from the fact that they appear back to back in the Torah. But why would God ordain that our experience of Sabbath should derive from what people did to make the Mishkan? And what are we meant to understand from that? I mean, you can't help but feel that it's somewhat arbitrary, or it seems that way. But let's start by looking at one of the verses which describes the Mishkan, and we'll see if we can find any clues. So, if you will, take a look at this verse from later in the chapter, which describes the building of the Mishkan. So, do you notice anything that reminds you of the Sabbath? In Exodus 35:21, we read the following: "Every man whose heart uplifted him, and everyone whose spirit inspired him to generosity, brought the offering of the Lord for the work of the tent of meeting, for all its service, and for the holy garments." I mean, did you see it? In the middle of the verse, the word work, or melacha, that's the very same word that we find in the Sabbath verses. Again, melacha. The word whose definition honestly eluded us previously. But isn't that curious that the word melacha links Shabbat, or the Sabbath, and the Mishkan? It turns out that this is the key to unearthing this deeper connection between the two concepts. And to see it, we'll need to trace the word melacha, or work, all the way back to the beginning, and to the first time it appears in the Bible, or Tanakh. So let's take it back to the beginning. And I ask you to ponder this while we continue. When is the first time that the Bible uses the word melacha? Well, the first time that we find that the word melacha in the Bible is at the very beginning, in the creation story, in the creation of the world in Genesis 2:2. "And God completed on the seventh day his work that he did, and he abstained on the seventh day from all his work that he did." Well, the verse says that God was abstaining from all of the melacha, or the work, that he did. And the term melacha seems to refer to everything God did when creating the world. That is, making the light, separating the waters, sprouting vegetation, forming the luminaries, and even creating the animals and so on. So, let's dig a little further and let's compare these two kinds of melacha. So, because depending on what verse you look at, you end up with a very different definition of the word. And if you look at the Mishkan, your definition is this: the work that Israel did to build the Mishkan. But if you look at Genesis, then your definition is as follows: the work that God did to create the world. Now, I want to make a bold claim, if I can, and ask this: what if I told you that these two acts, creating the world and the building of the Mishkan, are really, conceptually that is, the same thing? And the key here is understanding what God was really doing when he created the world. And once we see that, the connection to the Mishkan, and by extension the laws of the Sabbath, will become a little clearer. So, what was God doing when he created the world? But as we say, it was a busy 6 days. But if you were to take a snapshot of before creation and compare it to after creation, what would be the major difference between them? Well, it seems like a completely absurd question to ask, doesn't it? And because before creation, there was nothing. After creation, there was everything. But there's really no comparison. So let's try to assume God's perspective on this, if we can. Humor me. So here's how I see it. From the human perspective, it makes sense to say, before the creation, there was nothing. And after the creation, there was everything. When as human beings, we live in a world of space and time, this universe of stars, planets, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, etc. And none of that existed before creation or the moment of creation. Nothing existed from our standpoint. But if you're God, you don't need stars or planets, hydrogen, oxygen, etc. in order to exist. That is, before creation, before all those things existed, you were doing just fine. And you were living in your own tremendous realm, whatever that was or is, outside of space and outside of time. And as hard as it may be for us as human beings to imagine. Now, you were all that existed, and that was everything. And you would hardly say that before creation there was nothing. So, the more you think about it, from God's point of view, creation didn't make everything. There already was everything. And if anything, creation was almost a kind of diminishment, if you will. It was like God carved out a space in His everything for something else, for something that wasn't God. And for all of these physical things, the light, water, vegetation, luminaries, animals, and so on. Right? So, the Kabbalists, this is not necessarily my view, but the Kabbalists say, or called this idea tzimtzum, which means empty space or contraction. And God, they say that God contracted Himself to make a space for something else to exist. So, at first, God was all there was. And God decided to pull Himself back from a little corner of His existence so that something else, our world, could occupy that space. But why did God do that? Well, God did it for the same reason that many people have children. He wanted to grant life to a being, a separate being possessed of free will, to whom He could give and with whom He could form a relationship. But God created the world out of love. And what did God need to do to give us life? Well, yes, He had to create our physical bodies. He had to breathe the breath of life into our nostrils. But before all of that, God had to prepare the world for us. That is, He created the sun to give us light and warmth. He made the plants to sprout so we would have something to eat and oxygen to breathe. But God's work went beyond even that. And because to live in this world, we need more than just the sun and plants. We require perfectly calibrated laws of physics. That is, we need a strong nuclear force in perfect ratio with the weak nuclear force. Gravity, electromagnetism, Planck's constant, if you will, the 4 laws of thermodynamics, and the list goes on. But all these things need to be in perfect balance in order for the environment to work. And all of these things, these highly technical laws of God, or nature, God doesn't need them at all. In fact, He can live perfectly fine without them, with no problem. But being that He created, the being, that is us, the being that He created, man, does need them. And so God busied Himself with them and taking care that every aspect of this new world should be a perfect home for His new creation. And God did all of that out of love. Now, the whole process of creating the world was very much akin to the biology of having a child. A womb is a space like this, tzimtzum, right, that is within a person that strangely isn't actually there for themselves. And your body, all of your organs, every last one of them is really not there for yourself, but all there to nourish life, except for this one body part that isn't there for you, right? So, but for someone else, for life to be given. And that's the womb. So, a little piece of your everything, which is carved out to make space for something which isn't you. And what is that like inside of the womb, I ask? The conditions have to be just right. Everything is optimized to give the fetus exactly what it needs. But a fetus couldn't exist in our world without these things, and just like how mankind can't exist in God's world. So, let's do a short recap. When God created the world, he was really carving out a space in his everything, his realm, creating an apartment, if you will, or compartment of sorts for one that he loved. And to do so, God had to create and pay attention to a bunch of highly technical laws. That is, not because he needed them, but because we did. And so, let's ask the question again. What's the similarity between God creating the world and Israel building the Mishkan? But isn't this exactly what Israel did in building the Mishkan? But the people looked at their everything, the universe of space and time, and they said, we're going to carve out a little section of our world and set it aside as a home for God. And in doing so, they had to pay attention to lots of highly technical laws. Laws of Tumah, impurity. Laws of Tahara, impurity. Kodesh, the sacred. And Chol, the profane. And laws about what color, what material, and precisely what size the inner curtains would be. All of these sort of things. But these are laws that have nothing to do with the human realm. And we don't need them to exist. But they're laws that pertain to God's realm. That is, but the people observed them because they cared about God and wanted the Mishkan to be, if you will, forgive the reductive language, a comfortable environment for him. Now, it's much the way that God maintains the laws of physics for us. Now, the Mishkan is that sort of apartment or compartment that we make for God, the one that we love. Now, it's the way that we reciprocate what God did for us when he created the world. And that's why the word melachah, or work, is used in both places to describe God's creation of the world and to describe Israel's building of the Mishkan. Yes, one involved forming the sun and the stars, while the other involved weaving and dyeing curtains, but on a fundamental level, they are really the same thing, creating a home for the one, a home for the one you love. Excuse me. So the looming question here is this then. We're finally ready to come back to the question about our Sabbath, the Shabbat. And why do we look to the Mishkan of all places to derive the laws of prohibited labor? God rested from the melachah, or work that he did when he created the apartment for us. And that was God's Sabbath. So we rest from the melachah that we did to create God's apartment, or the Mishkan, or the Ohel Moed. And that's our Sabbath. And that's why we get our laws from the labor of the Mishkan. It all adds up, if you're willing. But we're just doing what God did. And it doesn't make sense. And doesn't it make sense that we should do what God did? After all, when God created human beings, he created us B'Tselem Elohim, in his image. In Genesis 1:27, we read this, and God created man in his image, in the image of God. Now, being created B'Tselem Elohim, in God's image, means that we are meant to imitate him. Little creator is meant to imitate big creator. And just like God created a home for us, his loved ones, so too we built a home for God, the one who we love. Now, building the Mishkan was an expression of our truly reflecting God's image. So, let's take a look at one final detail from our parsha and ask this question: who actually builds the Mishkan? Now, in Exodus 35, 30-31, we read the following. Moses said to the children of Israel, "See that the Lord has called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Yehudah, or Judah. He has imbued him with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, with insight, and with knowledge, and with talent for all manner of work. Yes, all of the people contribute to the Mishkan, but God appoints a primary builder, and he calls him Bezalel. So let's ponder this. Bezalel is a pretty interesting name. And what I would ask, if you were to break this word down, do you think we would find? And does it sound like anything that we've encountered in this teaching so far already? But how about this? Again, in Genesis 1:27, we read, Bezalel Elohim, in the image of God. So, if the Mishkan is the ultimate example of our imitating God, then it makes perfect sense that Bezalel, he who is in the image of God, should be the one to build it. And Bezalel is the one who realizes the vast potential of humanity to be like God. Now, please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm definitely not saying that we become God or gods or anything of that nature, so I want to make that clear first. But what I am saying is he represents all of us attaining our collective potential. He is our agent, in a way, to realize our very humanity. And he allows us to attain our destiny as Tselem Elohim, being godlike or in the image of God, and creating the apartment for the one who we love, El Shaddai, Adonai Tzvaot, and Elohim. Shabbat Shalom and Shavua Tov.